Hello and welcome to the Deep State Consciousness podcast. Simon Small is back with me today in what's kind of a second part of our previous discussion around his book, Star Pilgrim, where Simon wrote about spirituality in a science fiction context. And in that last discussion, we were talking all about how science fiction had spoken to his philosophical yearning as a young man and helped him to engage in the kind of deep questions that were on his mind and how that had accumulated in writing a book. One substantial theme we didn't touch upon, which has also been an influence and a great interest of Simon's, is the UFO sighting, encounter, abduction experience that has been prominent since maybe the 1940s, or maybe it's always been a prominent feature of human life and experience, depending on how you look at it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Simon, good morning.
Good morning. Great to see you again.
Good to see you too, and good to talk about this, because I've been interested in a lot of topics in my life that could be considered fringe, okay? But I think I've always slightly avoided this one because I'm just aware that it's a really deep rabbit hole. Something's always told me that, and having looked at it a bit now over the past few months casually, it's a subject I find so difficult to get my head around, to understand in any way. It seems so very complicated and hard to know what's going on, even to the point where all the big experts and long-time researchers in this disagree on so many different points. So why don't I give you the floor and you can start by saying what took your interest into this area, and what have you made of it?
Okay. As far as what brought my interest into this area is concerned, I think the simple answer, the honest answer, is I don't know. But it was a hunger and a drive and an urge within me to explore this area. That arose from some personal experiences I've had, but also just a little voice inside that said, this is really, really important. It's confusing. It's difficult to understand. At times it drives you bonkers, but it really, really matters. And I've tried to just follow that sense of guidance, I suppose, and try to go ever more deeply into this. The place where I would start with this is actually to do something which I think is the opposite of what most of us do most of the time. And that is when we come across something that fascinates us, something that, we really feel we want to understand, what we tend to do is move ever closer to it. Almost, if you like, figuratively put our nose up against it to try and understand it. In the age in which we live in modern Western culture, for example, the whole UFO thing and the whole encounter experience, I think this is what we do. We've got too close to it, so we can't see it in context. So it becomes very difficult to understand, and so also it becomes confusing. I would suggest that the way to approach this is actually to step back and to try and see what patterns we can identify, if you like, over the whole of human experience, going back thousands of years. And I think then what many people seem to experience now in some form it becomes part of a jigsaw, just one piece in a jigsaw. As we step back, we can see the jigsaw better, and so it starts to make more sense. And I've been kind of exploring this now for 30 years. I know for your viewers I may not look that old, but I am that old. And what is quite clear to me is that throughout recorded human history, and I'm sure before that, across every culture, people have been having experiences with a phenomena which seems to be from outside of our everyday reality. It's intermittent, it's difficult to pin down, but it's always been there. And as different cultures and different minds have encountered this, they've perceived it differently, they've labeled it differently, they've had different understandings about it, but I think it's always the same phenomena. So in a culture from thousands of years ago, they might have thought they were encountering gods or elves or goblins or jinns or whatever it may be. In our modern Western culture, we seem to be encountering little scientists and machines from other planets, and that's what we seem to see. But it is the same phenomena that's going on. Reality is not limited to our 3 dimensions plus time. Reality is far more complex than that, and in these other areas of reality, there are other living beings and other intelligences and other consciousnesses within which we have always interacted. And I think if you then take the modern UFO abduction experience and fit it into that, it starts perhaps to make a lot more sense. So that's where I'd start. I don't know whether that provokes any questions with you.
Yeah, too many, really. Just so the viewers know, Simon is actually 35 years old. He got into this as a very young child. No.
Absolutely, yes.
But just to say something like quite basic about it, really. I'm see if you agree with the narrative I've picked up. What we're talking about in its modern context is a phenomena that seems to either start or pick up a lot of pace around the 1940s, where people start seeing these lights in the sky, sometimes objects. They're detectable on radar. Sometimes what people are seeing is picked up by local radar stations, and they make movements which are impossible for aircrafts. And that tallies with what we call the abduction or the encounter experience, where people are finding themselves, they're recovering memories, or they have missing time, recovering memories of being on board these crafts, sometimes being experimented on, sometimes having information imparted to them, seeming to come back with things they couldn't possibly know through conventional means sometimes. And it's not limited to a few fanciful individuals. It seems to be quite a substantial phenomenon. Maybe in some ways up to 1% of the population have something of this. And it, for some people, it's traumatizing, and other people go into a period of spiritual or some other kind of growth afterwards and describe it as a very positive experience. Is that an overall, like, the modern phenomenon of view that you would concur with?
Yes, it is. This is how this phenomena, this ancient phenomena, that's how it's been perceived in Western culture, probably since about 1945 in round terms. Yes.
So what this seems to have provoked in me then is a whole variety of interpretations. So, like, one way you could look at that is psychological and say,
yeah,
okay, so this whole phenomenon kicked off about the time that we had concepts like space travel and little green men and so on. It's 50 years after the kind of books by H.G. Wells. So maybe the human psyche is having some sort of inner experience and mapping that onto it. On the other hand, you could equally say, well, hang on, 1940s. Now, that's just after the nukes went off for the first time. And it's just when we were sending rockets into space. So maybe the aliens from wherever got concerned about this. Hey, we better check it in on the humans. They're getting a bit serious with their technology. And you have people who have those two different and seemingly kind of valid interpretations offered to me. I know in my mind, initially when I look at this, I want to try and lock onto one and dismiss the other, but the phenomenon doesn't give you that in some way. It doesn't yield to an easy answer. What do you make of the different interpretations? Do you feel that you can have a kind of either or? It's either people from the Pleiades, or it's like fairies that have been around on the earth for thousands of years. What?
It's multifaceted. There is a phenomena, but which has many different elements, and which comprises, I'm sure, many different kinds of intelligences and consciousnesses, some of which seem to be largely indifferent to what we are, some of which seem to come from a place of goodwill, and some of which seem to come from a place of wishing to exploit us and give us quite a rough time. And yes, nowadays people think they're seeing spaceships. If you go back to the 19th century, people thought they were seeing airships, because that was what was in use at the time. If you go back to the experiences in the Middle Ages, people thought they saw sailing ships in the sky. What this is telling us is that our minds are encountering something for which our minds have no ready frame of reference. And so it takes what it's got and projects it onto the phenomena, and then sees the phenomena through those filters. And in 100 years' time, people will be experiencing this phenomena through different filters.
You don't feel we've got the right one now? Because I could understand, say, like in the Middle Ages, if people saw a spaceship, the only way they could interpret that is like there's a sailing ship in the sky, because they don't have the concept of even that stars are like our sun and there may be planets orbiting them.
Yeah.
But I know there's certainly a school of thought in this that says, okay, now we have the correct concept, that they're from other planets or they're interdimensional in some way. But you feel this might be the latest, well, it is the latest mapping.
One aspect of this might be that there is an interplanetary aspect. But to use kind of modern scientific jargon, I think fundamentally this is interdimensional. That we live in just a slice, a little slither of reality, and think that's it. Whereas we're actually living in a far more complex reality, but we are unaware of most of it. And at all those different levels of reality, there are different intelligences, different beings, different consciousnesses at work. And I think that, if you like, is the overall explanation. And if you say this to people, they often say, well, you know, you're saying something extraordinary. You're saying something that's, you know, incredibly difficult to believe. But we exist. That is extraordinary. That is impossible to believe. How come we are? Why is it so difficult to, you know, give credence to the idea that there may be other realities and other consciousness and intelligences within those realities, especially when the experience of countless people over the centuries supports that? There is actually overwhelming amount of evidence there. I'd like to say one other thing as well, which I think is very important at the moment, and that is with the UFO phenomena. In other words, the observation of mysterious lights and seeming vehicles in the air. That is now, I'm going to say, this may shock some people, that is now an established fact. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. It is incontrovertible that there is an unknown phenomena that seems to be operating in our skies. Some of the people listening to this may be aware that just before Christmas, there was an article in the New York Times revealing the existence of a secret Pentagon program that has been investigating this for years. And as part of that, they released video of incidents with the USS Nimitz, observed over the course of a week, multiple incidents, observed by fighter pilots, observed by radar, observed by all the latest equipment that is available. That is established. There's no question about it at all. The question has now moved on to, what is this? And the question has also kind of expanded to, and how does this relate to these people who seem to experience these things directly? These experiences, whether you want to call them abductions or encounters or whatever, because that is part of it. But in any kind of logical, rational sense, this is now an established fact, even though you wouldn't believe that to look at our media.
Sure.
And this evidence is now coming out almost week by week. And so what we're talking about here isn't something completely fringe anymore. It is now here at the center of our culture now, although most people are ignoring it. And so this conversation is even more important than it would have been before those disclosures.
Sure, and I recently watched the, is it Stephen Greer?
Yes, he's one. Yes.
Now, it's incredible on the one hand to watch all these military officers talking about their experiences and scientists talking about their experiences of, they talk about it in a matter-of-fact way, almost.
Yes.
For them, there's no debate. On the other hand, I'm never sure how much to trust from military officers. Potentially they have their own agenda going on there, and that's another whole area of this, as if it's going on. What have governments and militaries known about it over the past 50 years? So part of the reason I thought it'd be very interesting to talk to you specifically about this is because of your interest in exploring the depths of consciousness through the more mystical aspects of the world's religious and spiritual traditions. How do you see that angle playing into it? Okay, because I know that going back to the old stories of the fairy faith, some of them seem very random in a sense. Like the fairies seem capricious sometimes. They lead people into dances. They take people into the underworld and back up again. I don't know how that really ties in with a sense of spirituality. And in today's abduction experiences, some of them seem quite medical, like the beings that are taking people are quite disinterested in them personally. They're there for medical experimentations or whatever they're doing. And other people report a really heightened sense of spirituality afterwards,
Yes.
and believe that at least some of these beings are here because they're interested in cultivating our awakening, maybe because our technological level has gotten to a point where they feel that's a necessity now. I don't know, that's the narrative they're coming back with. So as a consciousness explorer yourself, Simon, how do you think of the experience in that way?
I can't give a soundbite answer to that, but I'll try and keep it as short as possible.
It's okay. I'm also aware that you mentioned you'd had some experiences of this.
I have. We can come on to that later. Yeah. But fundamentally, what I am, and I'll have to use kind of Christian terminology for this, but I know many people viewing this won't come from that background, but I'm somebody who seeks oneness with God. That's what I am. The focus of my life and of my consciousness and my energy and my attention is on opening to the presence of the ultimate, and I use the word God for that. But as I do that, and my faith is that this is how I'm guided in my life by that ultimate presence, that I found myself being directed into this. It's not central to what I do at all, but it seems to be part of my experience of this life, and and something I am meant to explore and think about and talk to other people about. And that's why I go into it. Now, the nature, when one encounters this phenomena, it can be everything from the most uplifting, illumined, inspirational experience you've ever had in your life, all the way ratcheted down to something that is awful and something that can be deeply frightening. What is going on there? I think I've already mentioned that just as in everyday life, you can meet people who can be inspiring and uplifting and full of goodness, all the way down to people who can seem to want to drink your energy, almost, who deliberately want to cause you trouble and deliberately want to cause you fear. So it is on these, let's call them the inner planes. As a general rule, I would say that what you encounter will reflect the state of your own consciousness. I'm somebody who lives a life of prayer, which is a very traditional way of describing it. So generally, I find I connect with, when I do connect with presences, they are of a very high level indeed, because it reflects where I am. Prayer comes first, in the middle, and afterwards. What I've also found is when my mind is dark, when I am not having the thoughts of the highest, which we all have, then sometimes I can connect something very different. It seems to reflect where I am at myself. And indeed my own willingness to know myself with complete honesty. And that is a big part of this as well. But that is not the whole story, because I think it's also part of this that sometimes the most extraordinary, awakened, illumined people can also have bad experiences. And this is where it's a mystery. This is where we really don't know what's going on. And it's also the case that people can have very bad experiences. As you've mentioned, it can actually almost seem to be part of their spiritual path. And that through those experiences, they grow tremendously and become people they otherwise wouldn't have become, even though the experiences were bad. We don't understand what's going on. But for me, the fundamental thing is on my relationship with the ultimate. my relationship with God, to use Christian language, and that is the anchor for everything. And I can only speak from my own experience. Other people will have to believe this or not believe it. But while I am anchored in that, it doesn't matter what I experience in the world or on these inner planes, I am safe. Even if I'm having a horrible experience in the world, in the everyday world, something in here knows it cannot be touched while my focus is on the ultimate goodness, let's put it like that. And so that's a very short answer to quite a complex question.
Oh, it's a very good answer. But I think it does lead us on to asking about your experience or experiences in this area then.
Okay. How shall I? Ever since I was a child, I've had a deep sense that I was surrounded by a greater reality than our everyday reality. Let's call it our three-dimensional reality. And certainly as a child, I may have mentioned this in the previous interview. In particular, I remember as a child having some extraordinary dreams I remember flying dreams. I remember coming back in through the door of my house when I was about, I don't think I was even at school, I'd been about 4 or 5, and floating up the stairs and going over the child gate at the top and going into my bedroom, floating all the time. Such a vivid dream that even as I'm speaking to it now, I can see it in my mind. I can remember again as a child looking out of the window of my house and seeing a UFO on the road outside. So vivid, so stark that I can see it now again as I'm talking to you about this. I have seen things in the sky which I have known to be anomalous. As an adult, I've had extraordinary dreams. There was a while in my life when I got very embedded in the world and doing boring things like earning a living, and this side of my life kind of went away. But later on in my 30s, it started to come back, and I remember one dream especially where I walked down into my kitchen and a UFO emerged from behind the fridge, which is quite an amusing thought in a way, but it was so paradoxical. You know, a UFO coming from behind the fridge, and it still stays with me. And I think it was telling me something about reigniting this interest. That dream reignited this whole area of exploration for me. But also it told me something about the nature of what we call UFOs, in that they're emerging from a deeper reality. They're not necessarily meeting the laws of physics as Mr. Spock knows them. And there was something in that dream as well. I also have very powerful experiences of communication with other intelligences, which are as real to me as this conversation we're having, and which are life-changing and have been life-changing. And quite a lot of that lies behind Star Pilgrim and some of the story. So if you like, those are some of the stories, some of the experiences that kind of also supported this whole exploration. But what I would say is that I have a deep sense that I've been into this for 30 years. There's always been a sense of it being fringe, something that polite people don't talk about. But it is now the whole phenomenon now is now becoming more central. It's starting to come more out into the open. And what's going on in America, which was sparked off by this New York Times article, I think in the long run is going to be of extraordinary importance.
Okay, I might come back to the disclosure part in a moment. With regard to the experience, it's just a minor question. I'm curious, and I think people also may be curious about what that visually was like to see a UFO on the road or behind the fridge. Was it like a little flying saucer emerging from behind the fridge? So that's just a minor curiosity. My more substantial curiosity is in the part about the communication with these beings, and that being life-changing. So it sounds like what you're talking about is channeling there, or a meditative experience of auditory
use
message.
whatever term you want. Again, this is an experience that is cross-cultural and goes back thousands of years in recorded history. It started for me because I started to explore questions of meaning, what on earth was going on, because I couldn't think of any reason to get out of bed in the morning. And then I got into meditation. And then one evening, this is going to sound so mundane, it's ridiculous. I was actually sitting on the bed with my wife, talking, eating a packet of crisps. That's how exciting my life is. And I suddenly found myself saying things to my wife, and I knew it wasn't just me saying it. And it was like I was watching myself. We were discussing deep questions, and I found myself answering and saying things, and extraordinarily, I was watching myself do it. I was still there. And at any moment, I could stop it. There was no loss of control. And that evening, that went on for about an hour and a half. My wife actually wrote it all down. I've still got the record of it. And ever since this time, that presence has been there. And that it comes and goes like waves. It's like waves of energy, and there are times when it's there strongly, times when it's just in the background, and often it's just great to know it's there. But from time to time, it has come through in the form of words and of writing. And when I've done public talks, although the people there wouldn't be aware of it, there are times when I'm aware it's been coming from that place. And interestingly, that's the time when it really seems to connect with people as well. It's like there's more than just the words there. And over the last 30 years, I've come to understand that that presence isn't separate to me. It's more of a community, or if you like, a brotherhood. That would be another word, fraternity, of which I am a part. And so when they speak through me, it's also me speaking as well, but me as part of this greater kind of collective. This is just central to my life completely. And that's for me what the experience is like. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but that's the best way I can kind of put it into words.
No, it's entirely helpful. I think it's a mystery for all of us that we might have that experience of our most profound thoughts and insights just emerge from somewhere.
Yes.
Okay, although we have dialogues in dreams. Like I heard a piece of music in a dream just yesterday. I was taking a nap. I've never heard. And then I'm waking up and contemplating, did my mind just compose that? Because I can't compose music.
No.
You know?
Well, Paul McCartney had that experience with the tune for Yesterday.
Yeah.
He thought he must have heard it somewhere. He had it in a dream. And interestingly, with the song Let It Be, which Paul McCartney wrote, that came from a dream as well.
Right.
I think that most of us, for a lot of the time, at some level, are linked into these other levels of reality, but we don't realize it. And for good or ill, they are influencing us. But as we become more conscious of it, we can become more discriminating about that which we listen to and follow and that which we don't.
Okay, we'll pick up on the discrimination in just a second, but yeah, so a lot of people have this sense of going into their depths, and that's where the real creativity emerges from.
Yes.
And even people who would be very opposed to ideas of UFO contact or spirit contact, I'm talking about maybe evangelical Christians, okay?
Yes.
But the Holy Spirit speaks to them.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And imparts all sorts of insight and wisdom.
Lord, if we put a certain label on it, we think it's fine, but it's the same phenomena. We put another name on that same phenomena and we think it's bad. You have to get below the labels to really try and sense the quality of what one is experiencing.
Okay. So then on to discernment. If discernment is not in the labels, if it's not mastering so much what we call the thing,
Yeah.
And it's more mattering what we're in resonance with. Okay. I think a lot of people I've encountered who have serious concerns about this aren't so much concerned that they're going to encounter something that looks demonic. They're concerned they're going to encounter something which looks angelic and turns out to be demonic. Okay, they're concerned about deception. And there is, in all these traditions, with fairy faith, with the UFO phenomenon, and with channeling and mediumship, there are cases where people feel they've been deceived, like they were encountering some wise spirit who they later think maybe was some sort of lower astral entity, or encountering a UFO that was there to guide their evolution, and then they think maybe it was just there to torment them. So how would you speak to that? Because I know that there will be people listening who will have that concern. Oh, is Simon being deceived here, though, by these beings, and they're setting him up?
I've already discussed for me what is central to this, and that is that my life is focused on seeking to open to God as much as I can. I never sought to go into this area at all. It's something that has happened to me as I've pursued that central path. And if tomorrow all of this sense of connection with these other levels of being were to drop away, that's fine by me. I have no problem with that at all. My focus is on what I would call a life of prayer. That is traditional language. And that is the greatest anchor in all of this and the greatest guide. But the other thing that is extraordinarily important is to develop self-knowledge with devastating honesty. Because when one does encounter presences that are not coming from the highest, what they will do is to exploit our desires to give us a bad time. And in particular, they will exploit the desires of which we are not acknowledging, of which we are not aware because we don't want to be aware. And as we become more open to ourselves, so we give less and less and less room for these darker elements to work in, to the point where we know ourselves completely, there's nowhere left for them.
Yeah.
But that isn't lifetime's experience. It's really what the whole idea of confession is pointing towards, although that has been a mightily abused area. It's just about incredible self-honesty without guilt, but just trying to be completely open as to what we are. And then there's no room left for any darkness. And so self-knowledge is the other great guard that can stand there if we are drawn into this area.
Yeah. And see if you agree with this. But when you said earlier about there being a resonance, I don't know if you use the term resonance, between the victim and the victimizer.
Yes.
If you like, I don't take that to mean that the victimizer is like the same as the victim in some way, but in an abusive relationship, there's a connection there. So let's say the victim is maybe on a deeper level of their consciousness believes they deserve to be treated that way, would be one example.
Yes.
And that opens up a connection of someone who wants to treat someone that way.
If you don't want something from another person, you will not be in relationship with them, and they will have no power over you. The problem is that most of us are not fully aware and acknowledging what we really want. It's deeply buried because of guilt and because of shame or whatever it may be. And also, often we want things that don't fit together, that conflict. And one day we want this, and the other day we want that. And we wonder why our life is so confused. So the thing that self-knowledge does, it reveals all these contradictions as well. And so self-knowledge is right at the heart of all of this. It's a very difficult path to keep seeing the truth about oneself. But it is the path that, if you like, inoculates us against the darkness, however we may encounter it. I mean, I could talk a little more about, if you like, the darkness, if you want, or these unwholesome presences one might encounter.
I think it might be helpful, Simon, because I do know it's a concern for the people I'm hoping will watch this conversation. Before you do, I'll throw in a question and you can say whatever you're going to say.
Okay.
So one theme that's emerged with people encountering this is an evangelical Christian theme of warding these abduction experiences off by calling upon Jesus, by calling.
Yes.
So now you can take a certain interpretation that is taken within the evangelical circles of, because Jesus is the one real Son of God, then you're warding off these demonic entities of him. There's other ways of looking at that, right?
Yes.
Of calling upon some image of that one consciousness, say, which could take different forms to different people. So I know in the Islamic world, people have had some success using calling upon Muhammad to ward off their intruders.
Yeah.
But the idea, because we've explored how relationships form according to what you're in resonance with, but the idea there's also a way to, on some sort of psycho-spiritual level, go no and stop and out and call upon something to expel an experience you don't want, like an exorcism almost. So that's something, a theme people might be curious about. So I'll leave that with you, and please say whatever else you were going to say.
Yes. If you are having these experiences and you don't want them, use whatever works to get rid of them. Absolutely. This must be something one opens to gradually by free will. It can be quite a scary experience sometimes, because one is encountering deep mystery. But if you've had enough, use whatever works to stop it. I have no problem with that at all. And probably whatever is embedded in your culture as the great metaphor or symbol of light or of goodness is what is going to work for you. But certainly this is something one opens to and explores by free will. I've known a lot of people, not a lot, but people who have found this a terrifying experience, but haven't wanted to stop it. But at the same time, it's the most amazing thing that's ever happened to them. And they live with it kind of day by day. And they would never want to lose it, even though it's deeply disturbing and terrifying. But if it isn't for you, use what works to ward it off. That isn't a problem at all. I mean, what I wanted to say just about the way I think what's going on when one encounters, if you like, the deep darkness and beings that come from there, I think what's going on is that they are, in a sense, having to feed off other beings. This is just, if you like, my deep intuitive sense that's developed over all these years, that what we experience, what we call existence or what we call life, is pouring out of a central source moment by moment. And it's what maintains everything, all the worlds, all the inner planes, all the universes, all the dimensions. But as a conscious being of free will, of which there are many, many different varieties, any such being can choose eventually to cut itself off from that. It cuts itself off from the source of existence itself. It's a kind of ultimate hubris or ultimate pride. And in order to continue to exist, it has to draw that life force from other beings who are still connected with that source. And it seems to be that these such beings trigger deep emotions, anger, fear, upset, despair, and it's from that somehow that they can feed to some degree off that. And I think that's what's going on with the really dark encounters. And in a way, it's an appalling thing, but in a way also one can feel deep compassion for those beings. Because certainly, as far as I understand, there's no way back. And if you read the accounts of exorcisms, for example, they are fascinating. The real ones within the Roman Catholic Church, which have taken place over centuries, and you get a deep sense of that, of the despair of these beings mixed up with all the nastiness. But I think that's what's going on. It is this kind of need to feed in some way. But to speak from the Christian tradition as well, which people may not accept, there is another understanding as well, and that these beings, it is taught within the deep Christian tradition, are like tethered dogs. They can bark extremely loudly, and they can be absolutely terrifying, but they are tethered.
Mm.
In other words, if one sees that actually they can't harm you, they can't do anything to the essence of what you are, then the fear will diminish, the anxiety will diminish, and the despair will diminish. It's only the belief that these beings can actually harm what we truly are that gives them the power to feed off us. But that's coming, if you like, from the deep Christian tradition.
Yeah, no,
Here's a big area which I've spoken about briefly.
It's and I came across in research I've done, like was a Canadian journalist, Joe Fisher, who got involved in transmediumship, and you've heard of maybe his book then,
I've read his books.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things he reports is the spirit that was coming through was very keen to start the people in the groups to start having sexual relationships with each other and their partners. He came to think that this astral entity or whatever it was feeding its own addictions there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But also, see, it's working with people's desires and their wants, many of which are hidden or only half looked at. And so again, self-knowledge there would immediately have rung bells with everybody there.
Yeah.
This is something playing with me, playing with my desires, playing with my urges.
And that's really clear. It comes across that Joe Fisher he found this idea of this ancient Greek woman who was in love with him, and they had this romantic tale. He really bought into that.
Yes.
So you could say, okay, there's a vulnerability, there's a hook there, which is being used then.
Yeah.
But you just slipped in there about there being no way back at a certain point, and maybe that's a position that's maybe not typical for someone who's into the more oneness consciousness thing. There's more of a sense of ultimately everything can be redeemed.
Yes, I don't know whether that's the case or not. It's the traditional Christian understanding. Jesus in the Bible talks about what he calls a sin against the Holy Spirit, for which there can be no forgiveness.
Very hard to interpret that part.
Very difficult indeed. But I think the traditional or deep Christian understanding of this is what he's talking about. That it is possible to so cut oneself off from the source of everything that one actually simply begins to fade, and that there comes a point where it is impossible to reconnect. I hope that isn't the case. It's not what I want, but certainly I'm part of a tradition that's much wiser than I am and has had thousands of years of experience, and this is what it suggests, but I hope it isn't the case.
Okay, that's a theme I'd love to delve into perhaps another time. Going back to disclosure now, okay, so some of the talk I heard after that New York Times article was around, the New York Times does not have a history or a reputation for saying things the US government really doesn't want it to say. Okay, it's kind of known as a state mouthpiece. So what then is the disclosure agenda? Is there a disclosure agenda? So, okay, there's maybe three ways this could go. Human beings individually could find out more and more about this phenomenon, and it could get to a point where it's just so widely known over the next 50 or 100 years that it becomes undeniable. Or governments could themselves be in the know about it to some degree and have a plan for disclosure. They'd be worried about people panicking and having a kind of, that Orson Welles radio show thing going on where farmers were arming themselves with their shotguns and so on. Or these beings themselves might have a plan for disclosure. They might be letting us in over time, but we're at a point in history where we could look at the situation now and say, well, over the next 100 or 200 years, maybe this all comes out, and as soon as it does, as soon as it hits that tipping point, then we're going to move into a different world in a way that nothing else in human history might compare to. So, what are your feelings about this disclosure and how the phenomenon is emerging?
Well, first of all, I really don't know what's going to happen. All I know is, having been involved in this area for 30 years, that New York Times article was a sea change. It was something fundamental shifted with that article. One thing you have to bear in mind, that the New York Times, yes, it has a reputation for having deep connections within the government, but it also had a reputation for deliberately humiliating anybody who talked about UFOs or alien abductions. It had an appalling reputation for that.
Right.
And that's why it was so shocking when that article appeared, for people who knew that history with the New York Times. I don't think that fundamentally governments know what's going on. This is just my own opinion. I think they know the phenomena is real and have known that for a very, very long time. I think they understand something fundamental about the phenomena, that the more human minds believe in it, the more easily it can manifest. And indeed, I think for a long time, this is the impression I get, there has been a strong position within many areas, let's call it of the government, we use that generic term, that has deliberately downplayed this whole area, and has tried to create an atmosphere of ridicule around it, deliberately to keep the door closed, so that the phenomena could not manifest as easily as it might otherwise do. And again, I've been in touch with this area for a long time. It seems that there are different views within government military circles. There is a view that says, for some reason, this now has to come out. And that's what you're seeing coming out through the New York Times and the article and other areas like that, which is being done very carefully, and they're using language very carefully. But there also seems to be another power center, which seems to be based largely within people with an evangelical Christian outlook, who see this as demons and the devil coming through, who are still trying to maintain the atmosphere of ridicule, that there's nothing there, don't open your minds to it. And there seems to be a power struggle going on around that. Whether the phenomena itself has decided it's time to make itself more manifest, who knows? Because we call it the phenomena, but there are many, many different layers of being and intelligences and presences at work. So the idea that there's something coherent happening there may be a bit naive. But what I really know is something has fundamentally changed now. And where it's going to lead, I have no idea at all.
Do you think that also there could be a desire to control our perception of it coming out? And I'm thinking about films like Independence Day, say, okay,
Yes.
so the Pentagon, the CIA have these connections into Hollywood. They're not two separate spheres, and the Pentagon put a lot of money into Hollywood, yes. And in particular in a film like Independence Day, which would be highly reliant on US military support for the aircraft and so on.
Yeah.
And there's a representation of these beings as invaders, and there's all sorts of narratives going on there, how they're cold, they can't be reasoned with, and we need to get behind governments to protect us from them.
Yes.
So how we see this phenomenon must be very much shaped by...
I am sure that mass media has been used for decades to try and shape our minds in relationship to this phenomena. It's interesting, in the early 70s, you had films like Close Encounters and E.T., which had a feel-good factor heavily there. And they seemed to move to, oh, they're horrible and they're going to conquer us and they're going to kill us. And something's been going on there with managing our collective consciousness. But for me, I mean, a point that really I think needs to be made is that I think the greatest fear that is going on around all of this with governments and with other power centers is that they actually don't know what's going on. And governments are meant to know what's going on. Mm. And one reason why this may be being suppressed is that they have no answer. And how frightening and terrifying is that? If for a powerful government to have to say, all this is going on, there are strange things flying around the skies, there are people having all kinds of strange encounters, which can be inspiring or terrifying, and we don't know what it is and we can't control it.
Yeah.
How can a government admit to all of that?
Removes their legitimacy.
Absolutely. And also, see, governments are about power. And what this phenomena constantly demonstrates, for example, with America, to the most powerful country as ever being, is that you have no power over us at all. We can do whatever we like. We can disrupt a week-long training exercise with your most powerful aircraft carrier and battle group just off the coast of America. And for a week, we can do what we like. We can fly all around you, and you can do nothing about it. Psychologically, that's humiliating.
Mm.
And that's at play here as well. It's the phenomena is showing us that we're nowhere near as important as we think we are. We know virtually nothing, and we have virtually no power. And that's a very, very difficult thing for the human race to take in, particularly a modern Western culture, which is used to being all powerful, where man is the center of all things. And the phenomena is showing us that's just a nonsense. And that's very difficult for us to accept.
Kind of like what people talk about with the Copernican revolution, where we're not the center of the universe.
That's it, yes. We replace that with being a center of the universe in a different way. Man is the measure of all things. And we're just being shown again it's nonsense.
One fascinating thing I came across was around the late 19th century, apparently there was a casual assumption that Mars would be populated. Okay. Yes. But there was also the assumption that they would be inferior and that we would go to them and bring Christian civilization and science and technology.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
It is. In a way, the whole history of religion and spirituality is human beings being constantly humbled because we have this inner tendency. You might almost call it the original sin, if you want to talk in those terms, of hubris, of no matter what evidence is put before us, whatever we experience, we just have this default position of thinking how important we are and how we're at the center of everything and everything revolves around us. And it's like for millennia, the great spiritual lesson has been, no, that isn't true. But somehow we can't quite grasp that lesson and learn it permanently.
Okay, Simon, it's a perfect ending point if you're happy there.
I am indeed, and thank you for this opportunity. I have never ever spoken about this at all.
Well, I really appreciate you.
It's the first time ever, so I didn't know how it was all going to come out. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. I think it's been fascinating for me, and I'm sure it will be for others too. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.